Welcome to Themis Podcasts. Themis is an award-winning platform that helps our clients and community manage their financial crime risk exposure. We aim to democratize due diligence through our AI-powered AML and KYC platform, our expert research and insight into emerging financial crime threats, and our deep dive intelligence for enhanced due diligence. Find out more at wearethemis.com.
Hello and welcome to the Themis Podcast. My name's Henry Wyatt, part of Themis' international team of financial crime researchers, investigators and technologists, and I'm delighted to be joined today by my colleague, Emily Hsu, for the latest episode of our series on fraud, which is taking us around the world, under the skin of the latest tech developments and inside the operations of criminal organizations to understand what's happening right now in the big bad world of fraud. You can find out all about these in our latest magazine, False Profits, which includes an excellent piece on the topic of the illegal wildlife trade written by my very esteemed guest today. Emily, welcome to the podcast.
Henry, it's really nice to be here.
Well, before we get into talking about your latest piece in a long line of very interesting research articles, I want to start with a very simple question, which is, how did you get into the world of anti-financial crime?
Yeah, so I think I'm a bit different perhaps from most of the other people at Themis in that I didn't come into Themis thinking explicitly about financial crime. So I'm predominantly researching environmental crime and I'm interested in environmental issues. But I guess the thing about sort of most of our environmental issues is that they're really fundamentally about money and about profit. And sort of you can trace most of our issues, from climate change down to deforestation to the illegal wildlife trade due to our sort of drive to consume resources, but also the drive for profit from these resources. And so that sort of leads us quite inevitably to having to think about financial crime and dirty money. So yeah, that's how I ended up here.
Oh, that's very interesting. And thank you for that. I think that is quite different from most of the background of the team, but considering some of the projects that you've been working on, your expertise, as we all know very well, and as I'm sure our audience will find out very soon, is absolutely valuable to our work. So to begin, I wanted to ask if you could just quickly give us the outline of the focus of your recent article. So what was the central issue that you wanted to draw attention to?
Yeah, so I was asked to write about fraud. So I was thinking actually less so about fraud, but what enables fraudulent behavior. And I was sort of thinking about this in relation to the illegal wildlife trade because I've been doing a lot of work on risk assessments for the illegal wildlife trade. And there are loads and loads of case studies where sort of criminals try to pass off what is an endangered illegal species as a different species. And then so I was thinking about those sort of legal grey areas and the gaps between our laws. I was like trying to ban the trade in a species and the actual reality of trying to make that ban, because like most things really aren't inherently illegal. So, if you think about the art, like the act of, stabbing the air, that's not inherently illegal. It's made illegal by the context of a person around you being stabbed. And it's very much the same with the illegal wildlife trade in that species aren't inherently illegal. So a sturgeon is not inherently illegal, but it's the fact that it's endangered and that it exists within a jurisdiction that has laws banning its trade that then makes it as such. So I wanted to look at this sort of that issue basically in the context of the illegal wildlife trade.
Oh, that's very, very interesting. And I think that really fits into some of the kind of key really important points that you make about the IWT, the illegal wildlife trade, in your piece. Could you give us an overview of what you think the key argument that you make in the piece are, and especially why you see this as a pressing issue right now?
Yeah, so the main sort of direction of inquiry is how do you know what is illegal? And so thinking about how do you identify whether a sturgeon has been caught from the wild or whether it's been raised in an aquaculture facility, the latter of which would make the caveat that comes from that legal. And I was thinking then also about how do we know that? So what are the sort of techniques or the technological advances that enable or prevent detection, and also about exploring the sort of potentials and limits of these technologies, because I think new technologies in particular, and also just technology overall, because we don't tend to understand how they work very well. It's easy to just sort of trust that, it's just a smart thing that gives us an outcome, and that's right or wrong, legal or illegal. So I wanted to unpack that. And the argument then really is about raising awareness of the sort of complexities and difficulties in actually making these distinctions. And so thus, and also trying to address IWT in general.
That's really, really interesting. Can you give us an example of how those questions play out? Whether that's from a particularly recent case or maybe a more famous one. Is there an example that you have, a particular study that you did that illustrates those risks or those challenges maybe?
Yeah, so there's a couple of good ones. If we're still thinking about sturgeons, so and caviar, obviously. So what lots of people do is they do isotopic analysis of caviar, because the sort of isotopic profile of an entity, or in this case caviar, will change sort of depending on the context in which it is. So as in, it's affected by the sort of things that the sturgeon eats, and the things that the sturgeon eats, and the sort of environment that it is raised in. So that will affect the composition of the caviar, which then sort of logically would allow a tester to identify whether it's from a captive sturgeon or a wild sturgeon. But there's been loads of issues of like NGOs sort of flagging farmed caviar as potentially illegal because it exhibits similar isotopic qualities as wild caviar, which investigations then went on to find that it was because it was actually from a captive sturgeon that was being fed with wild fish from that area. So there's so it's really interesting to see how even like these techniques really need to be implemented with consideration for how the specific context would affect how you interpret the results. And there's also thinking a little about timber and sanctioned timber, which is like sort of a slightly different issue in the wildlife trade because it's not quite as sort of straightforward as sturgeon. But we basically count for flora as well, so timber under the umbrella of the wildlife trade. And there's a lot of issues currently with sanctioned timber. So there's a lot of issues with sanctioned timber coming out of Russia. So basically, lots of countries are saying don't buy timber from Russia. And instead, then we've had a lot of timber being shipped out from Kazakhstan, which is sort of a country famously with very little tree cover. And so the techniques, sort of mass spectrometry techniques, are used to identify species of timber by analyzing the phytochemicals, which are basically the chemicals that are present in or extracted from plants. And you can sort of think of what you can do is sort of scientists will have a database of the phytochemicals in different types of timber from different places, which they can then compare with what is timber that might allegedly be from Kazakhstan. They can compare it with what does timber in Kazakhstan actually look like versus timber in Russia, which sort of seems quite straightforward. And like sort of these findings are really critical for the sort of lawyers and police that operate on these sort of nation units, essentially, because Russia, it's illegal if it's from Russia, it's not illegal if it's not from Russia. But the thing is, sort of forests don't operate on the same logics, the same territorial logics. In that, like, so obviously a forest could easily stretch from Russia across to Belarus, and then it starts becoming very difficult to identify like what's different then chemically between the tree that's on this side of the border and the other side of the border. I don't have answers for that, but it's just the sort of thing that's sort of cropping up now, which sort of really complicates enforcement efforts.
Oh, that's like absolutely fascinating. And you say you don't have the answers now, but I'm sure you'll have them soon. So these points, some of them sound very technical, and I'm sure they are very technical. But I mean, you referred to, for example, sanctions against Russia and sort of quite significant international trade. Are there any kind of statistics or ways in which you think that we can understand how significant and far-reaching these issues are? Because they're not just technical kind of one-off investigation problems, are they? They're much bigger.
Yeah, definitely. It's I guess the answer to any of these questions is that the nature of illegal activity makes it incredibly difficult to quantify and calculate. So the sort of number that's tossed around for the illegal wildlife trade is that it's worth around $23 billion a year. But that number is nearly 10 years out of date, and there are like such significant issues with how you come to that number. So I sometimes find it less useful to think about it in those terms, and sort of more useful to just think about how, when we're thinking about the illegal wildlife trade, it's things like anything from our food to like the sort of furniture to fashion, and the things that, while the illegal wildlife trade as a term sort of conjures up images of I guess like the African savanna or the Brazilian rainforest, it's really very much in the global north in particular a result of our choices as consumers. All of this really leads to things like species decline and collapse in some cases. So yeah, I guess I've gone a lot more qualitative trying to answer that question, but it is really just everywhere.
Yeah, I think that the qualitative response is sometimes, it'd be lovely if we had all the data exactly. But as you were saying, when you've got kind of very, very large scales of quite diffuse and very secret activities happening, it can be very, very difficult to know. And so, I'm sure many of our audience have never even come across Eastern European timber. They've never come across sturgeon isotopes in their daily lives, and probably unlikely to anytime soon, unless they're buying caviar for a New Year's party if you're doing quite well. But are there any ways in which kind of some of the lessons that you've kind of learned from your study of the illegal wildlife trade can be applied in our more day-to-day lives? When it comes to, ethical sourcing and supply chains and things like that, are there better things that we can do to protect ourselves from fraud as it relates to illegal wildlife transactions?
Yeah, it would definitely depend on the product, I guess, because it is so diverse. I'd agree that most of us aren't really eating caviar on a day-to-day basis. We might have sanctioned timber coming allegedly from Belarus into our IKEA flat pack furniture. So that's something. But I think the sort of best thing is really to just be aware as far as possible, which I understand is often not possible. The sort of the products that are easily embroidered in with the wildlife trade, and then to be aware of and B, to advocate for the transparency in supply chains. So even if we as sort of individuals don't have the investigative capacity to come up to understand where we might be consuming illegal wildlife products, we can, as far as possible, try to pressure the sort of companies that do this direct sourcing to do that due diligence themselves.
And what are there any tools that we can use to work out what the areas of risk are? Understand what things. Let's imagine if we're in the supermarket buying a range of products. How can we know which ones are at higher risk exposure, being involved in illegal wildlife?
Yeah, so the easiest, most straightforward way is sort of certification standards. I'd sort of say that with a grain of salt because I get our ecosystems, if we go broader, our ecosystems are very complicated. And so even though a lot of these sort of certification councils, the Marine Stewardship Council or the Forest Stewardship Council, are sort of run by people with lots of expertise who are trying really quite hard to make it easy for consumers to understand what is and is not sustainable, it is often very difficult to make those claims, even as scientific experts. And so I guess that's just something to be aware of. It doesn't mean don't trust anything that these sort of stewardship bodies say, because they are probably, as an average consumer, the most reliable and easily accessible source of information that we have when we're literally in the supermarket trying to make a decision on a can of tuna to buy.
Yeah, and then what about in a business context? If you are trying to transact and do business, are there ways that you can understand what types of business are maybe exposed to what types of risk? Because it sounds like some of these things, I'm sure that you've done a lot of research into this. Are there any kind of techniques that you think you found really helpful for understanding risk?
So even though our sort of supply chains, in the globalized world, basically stretch everywhere now, you can still sort of identify those kind of sectoral or often geographical hotspots, which might indicate a higher level of risk of something you're sourcing from that area being potentially illegal. So that's sort of a big crux of the work that we do with WWF, is sort of producing these risk assessments that make it as easy as possible for companies to get a sort of overview, look at sort of in X country, what are the risks, what's the risk level for, say, the illegal wildlife trade, or we also look more broadly at illegal mining and deforestation products, things like timber, cocoa, cattle, and so on and so forth. And so, there's those sort of risk assessments and lots of publicly available tools that try to raise awareness to risk to enable companies to identify red flags.
Brilliant. Well, those sound incredibly useful. I have actually spent plenty of time using the risk assessment tool that you helped create with WWF, and I have to say, highly recommend it. I consult it. It's the first thing that I consult when I buy my Christmas presents. I advise everyone listening to this podcast to do the same. But enough about my Christmas present buying habits. Emily, I wondered if you kind of had a closing message for us. If you had to distill your message into one key takeaway, the one sort of key thing that you think we all need to understand about the nature of today's illegal wildlife trade and also attempts to crack down on it, what would that be?
So it's really to be aware of the complex ways that illegality can manifest in our everyday lives, even though it's very easy, I think, especially in sort of developed nations, to feel very removed from where the things that we use come from. And all the things that we use have to come from somewhere, even though that seems so obvious. And unfortunately, the reality is that so many of these things that we rely on at some point will have sort of touched an environmental crime or a financial crime or a human rights violation at some point. So I think it's really to be aware of that, even though it is easy to feel removed, and I guess do as much as we can to try and ensure that our supply chains can be a bit cleaner going forwards into the future.
Yeah. So would you say that in a way it's a twofold process where we need to understand the reality, quite how bad the situation is, or at least has the potential to be in terms of our exposure to these risks, that then leads into a secondary process of really being able to hopefully do something about it? Or is that over-optimistic for me?
Yeah, definitely. Well, you can't really, I guess you can never really do something about an issue without understanding that without recognizing that it exists even. And I think like the nature of the convenience of our lives now make it very easy to think that things just come out of midair and arrive, in an Amazon parcel at your door. And and we definitely need to acknowledge that an issue exists to do something about it, even though like the do something about it bit is a lot more complicated than that phrase suggests.
Well, on that note, which I would say is qualified optimism, if I'm taking a very positive interpretation, I want to really thank you, Emily, for your time today, for sharing an initial insight into your research and your article in our latest fraud magazine. As I said, I really do recommend everyone to take a read of it because it's a fascinating document of both the issues that Emily's talked about today, but also of the global landscape of fraud in the contemporary international economy. But with that, Emily, I thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Henry. Thanks, everyone, for listening.
I'll say goodbye to our audience. Goodbye from this edition of the Themis Podcast.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Themis Podcasts. We hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to find out more about Themis, please do contact us via our website at wearethemis.com or drop us an email at info@wearethemis.com. Thank you.